Good afternoon. Welcome to the colloquium on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the 21st Century, a living document in a changing world. This is a symposium that we put together with members of the Commission, of the Global Citizenship Commission, which produced a brand new report just issued today, which was presented in person to Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon. The Global Citizenship Commission was formed 3 years ago, chaired by the Honorable Gordon Brown, as a means of looking at and refreshing the extraordinary 1948 document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was championed by and principally authored by Eleanor Roosevelt and adopted by all member nations of the UN at that time. The Commission decided to take a 21st century look at it, and in the course of its multi-year deliberations, research, and writings, produced a brand new report published and available online for free from open book publishers, which we urge you to check into after the symposium. Today we have a number of members of the Commission in the panel, and we will also hear initially from the Honorable Gordon Brown, the chair of the Commission, who will kick this off and help orient all of you to what the Commission's work entailed. So I'm honored. I'm Diane Yu, the Executive Director of this Commission, and very pleased to have this opportunity to introduce the speakers to you today and to provide a little bit of that context. As I said, we have a multi-year effort that took a lot of initial effort and funding. New York University and New York University's Global Institute for Advanced Study provided the academic support, administrative support, and logistical support so that the Commission, composed of 27 commissioners worldwide, could conduct its work. It was begun with a philosophers committee chaired by Professor Jeremy Waldron here at NYU, one of the speakers today, which did a brilliant job with a number of worldwide renowned experts in ethics, global ethics, citizenship issues, law, human rights, and economics and theory to bring together the best thinking to help underpin the work of the Commission. Then the Commission itself began meeting. First meeting was in Edinburgh. We enjoyed the support from Carnegie UK Trust and the University of Edinburgh for that meeting, which featured a Commission meeting as well as a special presentation involving Malala Yousafzai, who was also present to help us kick off the effort. We then met in the University of Bonn in Germany and enjoyed support from the university there, and then met in Abu Dhabi in the fall of 2014, and then in New York 3 times in 2015. The report itself includes an examination of the declaration and some recommendations as well, and we do hope, as I said, that you will partake of the opportunity to download the entire document through open book publishers. The panelists today include, to my immediate left, K. Anthony Appiah, who is a professor of philosophy and law here at New York University. He's taught in Ghana, which is where he grew up in part. He also was born in London, but he's taught in Ghana, France, the UK, and the United States. He's author of a number of noteworthy books, including My Father's House, Africa in the Future of Culture, and Cosmopolitanism, Ethics in a World of Strangers. He is chair right now of Penn American Center. He's been head of the Modern Languages Association. He's also chaired the American Philosophical Association and the American Council of Learned Societies. Emma Rothschild is from Harvard. She's the director there of the Joint Center for History and Economics. She's the Jane and Jeremy Knowles Professor of History there. She's also fellow of Magdalen College at Cambridge. She's the chair of the UN Research Fund for Social Development and the UN Foundation Board, and she is also has written a number of major books, including The Inner Life of Empires and 18th Century History. Robert Rubin was the 70th Secretary of the Treasury under President Bill Clinton. He previously had headed the National Economics Council. He was a vice chairman, co-chief operating officer, co-senior partner, and co-chairman of Goldman Sachs. He was also senior advisor to Citigroup. Currently, he is the co-chair of the Council on Foreign Relations and is a senior counsel for Centerview Partners. He's educated at Harvard and at Yale. Jeremy Waldron, whom I referenced earlier, who chaired the Philosophers Committee for the Global Citizenship Commission, is a university professor here at New York University, professor of law. He was educated in New Zealand and in Oxford. He's taught in Edinburgh, Berkeley, Columbia, and Oxford, as well as here. His area is law and disagreement, and he's also written a book with the title Torture, Terror, and Tradeoffs. He's also very active in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Laurel Bellows is the former president of the American Bar Association. She's the founding principal of the Bellows Law Firm in Chicago. She's also former chair of the Chicago Bar Association and the International Women's Forum in Chicago, and was the former chair of the Commission on Women in the Profession. She's an executive. She advises executives at businesses and industries throughout the world in strategic as well as litigation advice. She practices in Illinois, Florida, and California. She also has training as an arbitrator and mediator. Paul Boghossian is the moderator for this panel. He is the Julius Silver Professor of Philosophy, former chair of that department for 10 years. And he's the director of the Global Institute for Advanced Study, which I indicated was a co-sponsor of this commission. He's active in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's written books including Fear of Knowledge, Context and Justification, and new essays on the a priori. And he was chair of the steering committee of the Global Citizenship Commission.
So what we'll try to do now is have a conversation amongst the commissioners on the stage for the first half, and then we'll throw it open to questions from the floor. Does anybody want to react to some of Gordon's remarks to start with? Jeremy.
Thank you, Paul, and Prime Minister, thank you very much for your leadership of this whole project over these years. It has been an inspiration to us, and not just an inspiration, it's been the motivation for us to be involved in this. I'm not going to talk about the three particular themes that Gordon mentioned. Others will do that. But I wanted to say something about the comments that when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was set up, there was division among the countries of the world about what such a document could possibly be based on. And if you read the preamble, you find that there are copious references to human dignity and human equality. And we had to look at that as a commission, both from the point of view of 1948 and from the point of view of 2016. We had to look at why a term, relatively undefined term like human dignity, would be used. And I want to engage some of my fellow commissioners by inviting us to reflect that at the time the declaration was established, nobody knew whether it would work. Nobody knew what the subsequent history would be of the conventions of human rights being built on it and of the entire human rights enterprise growing up organically out of this initial declaration. Well, at the same time, nobody knew what we would make of this idea of human dignity as the basis of individual rights. People sometimes say, well, dignity is a kind of an empty word, which you can put any content into it that you like. And one or two of us were tempted at the very beginning to say that it was a fault of the Declaration not to have defined human dignity. But I think that's a mistake. What human dignity indicates is that we are basing these rights on the momentous importance of each individual. But different traditions have to fill out that formula in different ways. We can't be an absolute one-size-fits-all account of the momentousness of human persons. Dignity is like a holding term, which certainly insists that we have to talk about the momentous importance of each human individual, but the accounts that come up from the deeper foundations in each people's traditions and in each people's philosophies, each people's religious traditions, and each people's secular philosophies, those accounts come up, they get assembled, arrayed under the heading of human dignity, and from there they blossom out into the rights that we're familiar with. And I do think it's very important for us not to count it as a failing of the 1948 Declaration that it didn't define human dignity, but to count it as one of the ways in which it planted seeds of growth that is continuing even now in 2016 as people reflect on, compare rival accounts of, develop different traditions regarding the dignity of the human person. One of the things we did as philosophers on the Philosophers Committee was to insist we take that open, dynamic approach to the Declaration and not reproach it for having been ill-defined or having failed to tell us exactly what dignity means. It was the key to the success, to have a holding concept that would reference the momentous importance of each human individual without trying to nail us down to any particular account of it. And I hope that resonates with some of my fellow commissioners on this matter.
Yes, I'd echo the warmest thanks to Gordon and also to the amazing staff, including Andrew Hilland, who's here somewhere, who really put this together. I want to say something, just following on from that about history, but let me also tell a story. Like Gordon, I had the enormous privilege of visiting Nelson Mandela at his home with one of our commission members, Graça Machel, who couldn't be here today. And after visiting them, I went on to Mozambique with Graça to her house. And we had an extraordinary series of days visiting particularly health and education projects. But one thing that I really remember was Graça's daughter, Josina Machel, was at that time working on a master's dissertation at the London School of Economics, which was an extremely courageous study of two groups of schoolgirls in schools in Mozambique and how they fared in relation to what was then the appalling catastrophe of HIV/AIDS in Southern Africa. And the recommendations in this report brought that back to me so vividly, because education, not specifically education in relation to human rights, but the content of education, the organization of education, as well as the consciousness that young women are people who are holders of rights and can assert those rights, turned out to be absolutely essential in what it meant in practical terms to confront, as Mozambique has done relatively successfully, the tragedy of HIV/AIDS. I mention that partly actually because Diane, in her very generous introduction, said that I was chair of the United Nations Foundation Executive Committee. Graça was also a member of that. My dear friend Gro Harlem Brundtland is now the chair of it, and I don't want to be taking any credit from Gro. But just about the history, I mean, I'm a historian, I'm not a philosopher. I think the title, the subtitle of the report, A Living Document in a Changing World, is tremendously important for thinking historically about what the Declaration has meant. And more generally, we're in a law school about thinking about what law, and in particular international law, means in terms of people's daily lives. I mean, there's an enormous scholarship on the history of human rights, but it's substantially been about a few countries and about what historians call high thought. I think what this process brings out extremely clearly is the tremendous scope for just trying to understand why large, in a sense, empty words have meant a great deal in people's lives over a long period of time, and a period that's continuing and will continue in ways we can't imagine.
I thought Bob wanted to say something. I just wanted to, I'd like to thank all those who've been thanked as well, because it's been an enormously rewarding experience to think about these things in such smart and distinguished company. One of the things that strikes me is now moving from this very high level is that, you know, as Gordon said at the start, there are some places where the system, you know, has gaps. And I think one of them, which we make a recommendation about, which Gordon mentioned, which I think is important to think about, is the role of ideas of due process in relations between states and people who are not their citizens, and in relations between states and people who are waiting at the border. There is no country in the world that does a good job of this. There is no country in the world that gives good, responsible answers to people about why they've denied them asylum, entry, even the right to visit. And you know, one of the things that I think is living in this document is we learn the gaps. And I think that in the current global refugee crisis, we see that we don't have the apparatus that would entitle people at least to get a story about what states are doing to them when they deny them something at the border or when they refuse them entry. And we can think of many other contexts in which, I think the same thing, Gordon mentioned children. I mean, again, we don't really have good apparatus in place for articulating the needs of children in relation to the interests that the rights system protects. And again, this is not we begin, and it's important that we begin by expressing massive enthusiasm for what the UDHR achieved in the first instance, but that doesn't mean that there aren't places where I think we want to push a bit on the system. And I was glad when we talked to the Secretary General today that he seemed to be picking up on some of these suggestions, and someone like him I think is in a good position to try and persuade the many people who are involved when you try to get a new movement in the international arena to move forward on some of these things that we've suggested.
No, go ahead. I'll follow. Then I can't defend myself after your remarks, right? Well, then, first of all, I don't want to spend a lot of our time thanking people, but you must understand that this is a daunting task, and it would not have occurred without Prime Minister Gordon Brown, Diane Yu, and John Sexton, the support of Carnegie, and the wonderful Andrew Helland. So that it just has to be. But I think the other part of this that needs to be stated is that this is a very international group that has come forward with the report. Though you might see a lot of U.S.-centric folks here at the moment, that's because we were able to get here, to be here in New York, despite the kinds of schedules that we might have. But for me, there are 3 or 4 things that stand out of this report, and that is the courage of the group that I was privileged to work with. This is not a report, nor would I have joined a report that didn't have specific direction. So to take on issues that are not only a reflection of what happened in 1948 at the culmination of the Holocaust, at which the words were, where the world was universally comfortable with the Declaration of Human Rights in the hope that such an event would never occur again, and that's the message that comes out of the Washington, D.C. Memorial in Berlin as well, and in many countries, and Israel particularly, never again. But you walk out of those museums with those words, never again can we tolerate this, and understand that we tolerate a deprivation of human rights to the fullest extent every single moment that we're alive. So 1, the report has guidance. 2, the courageousness of recognizing the kinds of violations that were occurring. 3, the fact that if I were in a glass half full mode, I would say we've accomplished an enormous amount since 1948, and that the word declaration was a strong word and a celebration. And in a glass half empty mode, I might say that we have so much more to do and that we have accomplished so little. But what stands out for me is that at this moment, in a world of turmoil, and there's no sense comparing which days have been worst in the past or which days in the future could best the turmoil that we are engaged in. The recognition of this submission is that there is never a time when culture is an excuse for the deprivation of human rights, and there's never a time when turmoil or war is an excuse for the derogation of human rights. And when we talk about dignity, you did it so well, Jeremy, that I can't even begin to define it, but I see it as that really strong kernel that exists inside of us that makes each one of us the ultimate, a human being with a brain and the ability to affect change. And I believe this report should be taken by you who are here today and then discussed everywhere from the context that each individual not only has the rights, but what we've spoken at great length about is the responsibilities, that we cannot depend on others or on groups to accomplish what we must accomplish ourselves. So that's individually, to take action whenever we can. Now, I usually speak about gender equality, and I will, but I don't think that that's where I would like to spend my emphasis, although there's certainly barriers persist, and racial inequality, and all the inequalities, the I words, all right, that are rampant. But I would like to point out one thing about slavery. Andrew Forrest is here from Walk Free and from his many ventures to do good. But this venture of Walk Free, to believe that we can in fact eliminate slavery in our world, is something that I have advocated and will continue to advocate. People come to me and they say, you can't possibly eliminate slavery, Laurel. And I respond to them by that. I would like to think it's a Chinese proverb. It's the old proverb that says, those who say it can't be done should not interfere with the people doing it. And Andrew would be one of those who would be the people doing it. In the United States, we have slavery. We have sex slavery, and we have forced labor. And I speak about the United States because I don't have the right to speak about any other country, since the United States has a $9.5 billion profit industry of sex slavery and a $150 billion profit every year in forced labor, which we will talk about at length if you would like to. My point being, we have a lot of work to do, a lot of recognition, a lot of the violations of human rights, including slavery, and I do not use the word human trafficking, I mean slavery. Those derogations are invisible to us. Those epidemics are invisible to us because we just simply are not aware of the facts. And so I'm delighted to have been a part of this reawakening, I hope. Thank you.
A number of themes have come up that...
I'm not going to thank anybody. This thing took a lot of my time. But having said that, I've been delighted to be part of it. I thought it was important, and I think intellectually it has been very interesting. I'd like to raise a few of the complexities that strike me. In 1948, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was issued, I think Laurel may have said, or I think it was Laurel, that they vowed that these things will never happen again. Well, they've happened many times since 1948. And I think that there's a lesson. 800,000 people, as you said, in Rwanda, in our administration, because we didn't pay attention to it, and so many others, Syria right now, and so forth. And while there certainly have been very serious accomplishments, South Africa, for example, and many others we can mention, I personally think, and this is just my view, one person's view, that human nature has a kind of a Hobbesian quality about it. And I think that we are always going to be, if you go, the whole of history, of human history, is a history of war, brutality, indifference to poverty. I think it's extremely important to try to counterbalance that. And one reason I think this report can be very important, it may not be if it just dies on the vine, but it can be important, is as a counterbalance to what I at least think are the proclivities of human nature. And I think there will always be that struggle between what I at least view as a sort of a Hobbesian proclivity. What others may disagree. I don't profess to have any expertise on human nature, just my impression, having watched for a little while. The Hobbesian proclivities of human nature, and then the kinds of ideals that are encapsulated in this report. So that's one comment. Comment two is this report raises a lot of interesting intellectual questions. What is a human right? Is it, as Paul feels, for example, a universal truth? Or is it, I have had a lifelong belief that there are no provable absolutes, and that ultimately every principle is based on an assumption, on faith, or on a belief. And so I would think of these as core human values as opposed to universal truths. Either way, one could be equally supportive of and feel equally strongly about these principles, but it is an interesting debate. Somebody said that, I think, Laurel, that culture shouldn't be allowed to be an excuse for derogation of human rights, but there are different cultures in the world, and some of the cultures that exist are going to be inconsistent with some of the principles that we've set out here. And I think one of the purposes this thing could serve, if it turns out to be useful, and as useful as it could be, is it could generate intellectual debate about what are human rights? What are the trade-offs? Because there are trade-offs. Paul said at our discussions that all rights at some high level of abstraction are equal as aspirations, and I think that's absolutely right. But when you come to implementation, there are trade-offs, whether you like to face it or not. Every country, even the richest, has limited resources, and yet many of the human rights that we advocate require funding, and nobody has limitless resources to fund. Therefore, somebody's going to have to make judgments about trade-offs. Another good example, which is in the report, is I personally, I'll speak for myself, I greatly value my privacy, and I also greatly value being protected against terrorism. But there, again, there's a trade-off, and somebody's going to have to make a judgment. So there are a lot of very complex, at least I think, intellectually complex issues in this. And that, I think, is a strength, not a weakness. Because it's those, if we recognize the complexities, then that is a basis for a debate across the globe, and also as between different cultures, not all of which will agree with every part of this report. And that kind of debate could itself strengthen the awareness of human rights, the involvement with human rights, and hopefully the greater role of human rights in guiding human and state behavior. And so I'll just conclude with one more comment. I think the great challenge now is how do you take this thing, which really was, I think it's an enormously thoughtful work product, how do you take this and give it resonance in the chaotic world that we live in? And that, I think, is an immense challenge that will not be easy to be met, but if it can be met, then it gives us the opportunity to have an effect on human behavior.
Thank you, Bob. It's been very, very helpful to have your real-world considerations intervene on some of the more aspirational philosophical. I'm sure I didn't quite put it that way. Well, I mean, the point that I hope other people will want to weigh in on, first of all, the trade-offs, which is a very interesting thing. I think there is an important distinction between saying that the rights themselves conflict with one another, as opposed to saying that under certain real-world conditions, the implementation of one right can conflict with the full implementation of another. And you're absolutely right that there'll be circumstances where you really have to decide what your priorities are and rate them accordingly. And in fact, one of the things that we need to do as a society, for instance, is decide how much risk we're willing to tolerate versus how much privacy we're willing to forego. These are real issues, but I think from a theoretical point of view, there's no reason to think that the rights themselves conflict with one another.
Well, just to highlight a point that I think Gordon mentioned in his initial comments, we shouldn't lose sight of. One of the things that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights didn't do well was to talk about cases where we might have to suspend or derogate rights in circumstances of emergency. Subsequent covenants, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, have approached this, but it was one of the things that we wanted to raise a question mark. It would have been good to have had that sense of the real world conflicts and trade-offs that crop up. It would have been good to have that put forward within the document rather than seen as something that had to be brought in a curmudgeonly fashion from the outside. Because it's important that human rights theorists lay claim to the terms on which these trade-offs take place, by not insisting that the trade-offs can be promiscuous or indifferent to the values, the real values that remain important, even in the circumstances of danger. So that was one of the themes. It's in the document. I think it's an important one.
The other important theme that Bob was worried about is interestingly touched on by Jeremy. So what Jeremy tried to say is that when we appeal to human dignity as the basis for these rights claims, Nevertheless, that's consistent with elaborating this notion of dignity in different ways in different traditions. And that seems to suggest that you can have conflicts in views about what human rights there are, even though they're all equally legitimately based on the same notion of human dignity. I'm not sure I fully see that. That is, I don't see that you can have a conflict, a conflicting view about whether somebody has a certain right, where both parties can be correct. Did you mean to suggest something like that picture, Jeremy?
I did not. What I meant to suggest is that when you're elaborating the foundations of the right, it's a mistake to be dogmatic about a particular line of philosophical elaboration. This is a document, a declaration for the world, and the world has a number of streams of tradition that have tried to make sense of the importance of human individuality and of the preciousness of each life, and to exclude any one of those streams from our thinking about the foundations is, I think, a mistake. Now, certainly what you think about the foundations will make a difference to how you pick up any particular right and run with it. And so there will be room for a plurality of interpretations. And again, that's not a bad thing, to have, as it were, some sense of openness at the level of formulations as well as the level of foundations. But I didn't want necessarily to embrace the idea of completely contradictory accounts of rights operating side by side.
Just slightly to continue this theme, I mean, I think that one of the things that the Declaration does is to provide us a kind of framework for having these arguments. If you think of the issue as, what does dignity demand? That's a way of, and then somebody says, well, dignity flows from the fact that we're all children of a loving God. So, but that, and if you don't think that's the right way to think about it, nevertheless, you're provided by the language of dignity with something to say, as it were, in support of your conception. And this allows us to agree, for example. I mean, I think there's a very nice model here in the way in which the First Amendment treatment of religion in this country can provide a model. We all have profound, I think, whatever our religious traditions, we all have good reason for supporting the, let's say, free exercise or non-establishment, whichever bit of it you want to focus on. We have those reasons, but particular traditions will articulate them in particular ways. If you're a Protestant, you think that individual conscience matters in a way that means your understanding of what free exercise is a specific kind of understanding. I don't have to buy that particular Protestant picture to think that nevertheless, Muslims ought to be allowed to build mosques anywhere anyone's allowed to build a church, or anyone's allowed to build a synagogue, and so on. That people ought to be allowed to express their religious identities in public and so on, in their dress and things like that. And I can think that deriving it from a secular picture or from one of many different religious pictures. I probably can get there from traditions that I know nothing about. But nevertheless, the framework gives us a way, again, of talking about what it is, what's at stake, and it allows us to agree, even though we have different foundational pictures, on a practice of not torturing people, a practice of not denying children education, a practice of not enslaving people. I mean, these are practices that we can agree on, and each of us will have deep commitments to them, which may derive from different stories.
So now you get a sense of how much fun we had when we were working together, right? Because I love Anthony, but my view of the United States and religious freedom is quite different. You know, on the practical basis, we're hearing too much rhetoric from my point of view about people who don't have the right to practice religion in a certain way, don't have a right to build their religious institution in a certain place. And by the way, my God is not all that loving all the time. My God can be vengeful, and so I try and listen to her, all right, and follow her guide. Right, right. But I would go in a little bit different direction for a second and speak about some things we have not mentioned so that when you're asking questions, you might come in a different direction. And I'm not sure my moderator can kick me because we're too far. All right, so one that we haven't talked about is the conflict between poverty and how that might relate to the right to work and child labor, right? So now we have that issue out there that says a child of undefined age, because every country has a different right to work level, should or shouldn't work. Now, and the question is whether that work is by choice or by force, or whether in fact they've been born into a hereditary slave condition. But on the other hand, if they don't have those jobs, one would argue that they are earning no money at all. And how does that work out? The privacy versus security issue that Bob has brought out is one of the strongest arguments for a dispute on a human right. I absolutely believe in my right to privacy. I absolutely believe in my right to security, and I will give up most anything in order to retain my right to privacy, except when it comes to my own family. All right? So, you have to be very practical. Now, I do believe that this report gives us an opportunity to effect practical solutions. And that's what I think we should be talking about, because I think we have the ability to effect change.
Very good. I think it's time we heard from the audience. So there are a couple of microphones on stands. Please, if you could make your way to the stand and ask your question.
So my question is that you guys have been talking about the world is changing, and therefore you're putting in a lot of the gaps that the original declaration did not mention. So my question, like when you were discussing and talking about the original document, was there something that was mentioned there? You're like, okay, this is mentioned there now, but in the 21st century, it doesn't apply anymore.
Was there anything in the original document that doesn't apply anymore?
I mean, just very briefly, some of the ways in which things are set out in terms of framework in the original document doesn't apply. It talks a lot about colonies and dependencies and each country being responsible for human rights in its own empire. And in a way, this has faded away quite quickly after 1948. So there are some frames of reference. I think also in some of the detailed discussion of, say, the right to education, it reflects the preoccupations of the age and doesn't necessarily tell us what would be uppermost in the minds of an educational rights campaigner like Gordon Brown today. So you find some of the levels of detail and some of the frameworking devices.
But on the whole, it's a surprisingly relevant document even today. Yeah.
There's an interesting example. It talks about rights in employment and right to paid vacations, and that's that perhaps reflects the circumstances that they were thinking about an organized industrial labor force in relatively rich countries. But certainly for me, I think it would be great if there were paid vacation for everybody working in the world. So in that sense, they were sort of ahead of us, given differences of context.
Yes, please.
I've actually already had the tremendous privilege of reading the document, and I must say that it is a wonderfully dynamic tool for change, for tangible change. I think what I would like to most ask about today, the Prime Minister mentioned failure of the UN in the past in regards to Rwanda, is how you think the document will be able to implement change or create access to these rights that you've deconstructed for some of the most vulnerable people in the world in the context of the Syrian refugee crisis that are facing vulnerability to not only violence and tremendous oppression, but also to slavery and trafficking and displacement.
Thank you.
One brief comment. I think that's the right question, not only with respect to the specific that you raised, but the whole document. For it to mean something, it has to become part of public debate. It has to become part of our political debate. And the question is how to take it from being a document, a piece of paper, and make it real. And to do that, I think one is going to have to, this is my view, I'm not saying it's right, it's just my view. I think that to make that happen, one has to recognize the conflicts that are inherent in the things that we believe in. And I'll give you one example, even though I'm sure that people will disagree with this. There is this question, I think Anthony may raise it, of migrants and refugees and what should happen. And it's easy to say, I'll put this slightly differently. These people are in tragic circumstances. On the other hand, if you're a recipient country, how much of this can you absorb without it having social, economic, political, and other effects that you simply do not want to live with? And so I think for the recipient countries, there are very real conflicts, trade-offs that have to be faced and debated. And I think it's only by recognizing that there are trade-offs and conflicts in virtually all of these things to which the term human dignity is not going to be a helpful solution that makes this real. And I guess it follows, at least in my mind from that, that if you're going to make this real, we've got to find a way of engaging people in those. I think the great beauty of this thing actually is its intellectual complexity. And then we have to find ways of engaging people in a meaningful way, people, whatever I mean by people, the public and political systems, engaging in the conflicts and the issues that this thing presents. And in that way, I think this thing could have effect.
But I think this point does go very clearly back to implementation, because the recent history of the origins of the present refugee crisis have a lot to do with the fact that international funding to the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees, international funding even to the International Food Programme, was cut back at an absolutely critical moment in the development of the crisis. So the question of reliable funding for international actions is a really important practical one.
Emma, I was just going to say in response, having lived in an administration for 6.5 years and fighting budget battles of all kinds of things, the question is, when that funding was cut back, were the kinds of perspectives that are contained in this report part of that debate in a serious way? And my guess would be no. And that's why I think your question was such a good one. How do you give this report traction so that it is in people's it's in people's minds, or political systems' minds and the public's minds, as part of the debate about the kinds of funding and other issues that are involved in this?
But it's by no means the quote-unquote fault of one large country or three large countries. I mean, this is a very widespread difficulty with UN funding for things that are off the regular budget. Well, we don't agree on that.
We don't. The right question to ask about the UN is what the world would be like without it. I think that we didn't make this, I didn't suggest it, and we didn't make this proposal, but one thing that has often struck me is that Bob's talking about the way in which political bureaucracies actually work. And one of the ways in which they actually work is that there's considerations get raised if there's somebody whose job is to raise them. And there's something to be said for having a cabinet-level person who's a human rights person, because in those discussions, it's his or her job to say to people, look, we have obligations here. We signed up to these treaties. In the case of the United States, we actually have a constitution that imposes on us obligations to be a country of laws and so on. And I've always thought it'd be good, there's something called the Paperwork Reduction Act, which has created more paperwork than anybody has ever imagined, which requires every civil servant who's issuing a document to explain why this piece of paper is necessary. And what they normally say is, this piece of paper is necessary in order for the government to do its work. So somebody puts a lot of their time into fitting in a thing that says that. So it hasn't worked. But I've always thought it'd be interesting if another thing, since we do have the Paperwork Reduction Act, would be just to have a line that says, I have considered the human rights consequences of the proposal I'm making. And you have to sign off. You have to put your name under a thing. And just, which means that in every moment when you're doing the job of a civil servant, when they're doing the job of working in the complicated circumstances of a very complicated bureaucracy, just the fact that it's It's part of your jobs to have these things in your head. So I think those are two, these are not proposals in the document, but I mean, I think that thinking about these issues can make people see that they might want their governments, I'm not talking about the United States in particular, they might want their governments to have mechanisms for infusing these sorts of considerations into discussion so that it's a respectable thing to say in a cabinet meeting. Look, the human rights consequences of that would be unacceptable.
So your question was complex and wonderful. All right. So now we have the United Nations that's comprised of many, 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 many more countries than were available to sign on to the Declaration of Human Rights. And one of the issues we addressed early on was, would those countries re-sign this document? Right? Would they evaluate where they stood today on human rights, even in the same light as they did in 1948? And would the countries that have come into being since sign this document and recognize it, even for the purpose that it is a discussion starter or a reminder that perhaps these are important internationally, would be a reason for its being. Then the other thing that we called into question was we took a position quite clearly that we were not advocating the elimination of national borders, but we were recognizing that we are an increasingly global world and that there is simply too much interaction among all countries and peoples, not only because of migration and refugees, but simply trade, that this is something that will and does affect human rights, not just as a matter of business, but, or as I say, those who are vulnerable, but this is an issue that never even dawned on those who drafted the 1948 document. One issue that we did speak about which I'm very pleased, is corruption and the interplay between corruption and the violation of human rights. And that, I think, is an important new component of the conversation. And lastly, I think that it strikes me, as it does in almost everything, that if you look at the need to achieve change in a huge perspective about requiring absolute change to human rights, you'll never accomplish anything. All right, what we need to do is break up the conversation, all right, and start to attack each individual right and those who might be responsible for not so much its violation, but for its change for the better. Stop looking at the negative side and look at the positive about the change and who might be responsible for it.
Thank you, Laurel. I think President Kufuor would like to make a remark.
Thank you. I believe the original document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was conceived out of an ideal to create space for the world to grow into. You cannot put a time limit on it. And I'm sure the aspiration was that from time to time, as the world expanded and with all the complexities, man would be guided. When I say man here, I include woman, of course, would be guided by the basic fact of common humanity. It talks of global conscience. It is that conscience that would enable the adjustments from time to time of what would become practical in the governance of communities and societies all over. When the adoption was made in 1948, and if you took the African continent, for example, there wasn't a country on the continent that was independent. My country, then Gold Coast, is now Ghana, was in the possession of Great Britain. And the people were treated more as subjects of the crown of Great Britain, not as citizens of Great Britain. In due course, I think 10 years later, Ghana became independent. We changed our name, but more out of protest, to assert our identity as a free people. In fact, the national motto we adopted was freedom and justice. It's that innate freedom that I believe the makers of the UDHR try to assert basically in all creatures there's this thing, freedom, even in lower creatures, that really should not be restricted. But then if you allowed everybody to move about freely as they wanted, what might ensue might be chaos, because then we might be thrown back into the jungle law situation where it would be survival of the fittest. And in human community where we think we are higher, and we could be enlightened by reasoning and so forth and so on, the idea was that there should be social contracts embedding the idea of freedom in such a way that in all respects of governance, there would be that essential thing about the dignity of the individual that would limit, say, the people in authority, the governments, violation of which basic entitlement of the individual should bring, some punishment to the ruler. I believe this was the idea. And this idea, I believe, is timeless. I believe the exercise of this commission should really not be to be just descriptive of what transpires. We should always revert to the basic principle of acknowledgement of the basicness of human dignity. So I don't buy the idea of trade-offs. Who decides where to draw the line for trade-off? Invariably, dictators would resort to this, say we want economic development at the expense of the individual's dignity. It's been used, and it's still being used. So we should rather insist on talking of the basic, fundamental, inalienable rights that the writers put in there. And then we know that practically, for lack of, say, resources, we cannot give everybody equality of opportunity in terms of education at a particular time. But we should always let it be there to ensure that the governors will not forget that they just do not have the right to deprive or compromise the basic rights of people. In Ghana's constitution now, there's a whole chapter described as directive principles. It's not practically enforceable when you say everybody should have free education. Education at what level? Is it the primary or secondary or tertiary? But they say people are entitled to education. If you challenge, the courts will remind you that's directive. It's showing the way to the governors. I believe this is what the whole thing is about. Fortunately, now we've got the United Nations straddling all the races, continents, and everybody, and pointing the way. And I believe, again, upholding the principles originally founded. The principles initially couldn't have been exhaustive because, as I say, timeless. Today, we are in the digital age. In those times, the internet was not there. Today, we have jets flying easily among the continents. People see others everywhere. People who used to clad themselves in kimonos these days wear the denim jeans. Even the music. Culture is dynamic. We are moving. But centrally, the rights, the basic right of the human being, the dignity of the human being, is spreading. This is why we had the Arab Spring, for instance, and it's spreading. Dictators are being challenged. But still, there's some resistance on basis of, say, religion. By and by, I believe peoples of the world would come to assert themselves even against religion, against race, against poverty, and people are being humanitarian. Let there be a disaster anywhere, and you have people rushing, even at the risk of their lives, to go and help. This is what the whole thing is about. And hopefully, if we are persistent, if we encourage the global community to move in a way, upholding centrality of mankind, of the common humanity, as the Pope did last week, taking Muslims, 6 families, from some Greek island with him back to Rome, the citadel of Christianity. The whole idea is that man is waking up, and this is what I believe our effort should be about. This is what we've tried to do. If we talk of trade-offs, you may get somebody sitting somewhere deciding that because I want to give my people education and the resources are limited, I deny the poor child from poor home the right to go to school. Why the same man that is making this, giving this diktat, might be riding in Rolls Royce, sending his children to the best schools in the United States or Britain, living it up, loading it on his people. So I don't think we should encourage trade-offs at all in these things. Let us assert common humanity, global conscience, as central over and above religion, politics, economy, everything. And then let us give ourselves the space. In due course, common sense is part of it. People would know when the resources are not there, and they would buy their time. And then representative governance. Nobody should think he has the right to tell others what to do or what not to do. And that if we would rather operate on the basis of the sovereignty of the individual, sovereignty of citizenry. We are talking of global citizenship. Then common sense and conscience would guide all international relations and in due course. And I believe the United Nations should be encouraged to be the guarantor of this trend. Not just for the short term, it will continue indefinitely, and thereby would come to mitigate the dictatorial tendencies, the corruption, the abuses of human rights in due course into eternity. We are talking climate change, for instance. We may not have solutions yet, but at least everybody is waking up. Last December in Paris, United States, China, civil society organizations, big corporate organizations, everybody agreed humanity was endangered and we should do something. It was humanity. We didn't hear of, sorry, we'll finish soon. We didn't hear of geopolitics. We didn't hear of profit by corporate world. Rather, we were talking safety. This does not mean still people might not be at work trying to dribble others, but we shouldn't give up. We shouldn't talk trade-offs. We should just talk basic principles to center common humanity in all international relations. Thank you very much.
President Kufuor, thank you very much. I'm sorry to have had to interrupt your remarks. We're nearing the end. We need to leave some time for the President Emeritus to conclude and sum up. I would like, just before he does that, just to briefly say, you know, people do ask these days what universities are good for, and I think this is a very good example of what they're good for. They have the unique combination of expertise, standing, and neutrality to bring together such a diverse range of people from many different walks of life to accomplish what I think is a unique achievement in this report. So I'd like to thank Prime Minister Brown for his vision, and President Sexton for his support, and Diane, Andrew Hillen, Melissa Friesen, all of whom made this report possible. It's been a great privilege for the Global Institute to sponsor and participate in this. So now, President Sexton.
Thank you, Paul. I want to say something eloquent, so let me just say it very simply. Wow. Paul's right, as he almost always is. Sometimes there are trade-offs. Paul's right. This is what universities are about. Let's not make any mistake about the headwinds here. Bob Rubin talks about the Hobbesian nature of humankind. Some of you know that I have a doctorate in religion. Some know that the Prime Minister comes from good Scottish blood. He'll recognize this word, concupiscence. Concupiscence. Do I actually have a word that you don't know? Concupiscence. The effects of original sin. Whether you accept the metaphor or not, there's power to that idea that none of us, no society, no individual will be perfect in this world. So there's a fundamental choice to be made. And that is, on which side are we going to bet? Are we going to try to make it better? We're going to try to fight the good fight. Maybe even if it's quixotic. There are tremendous headwinds here. Not just headwinds against the concepts in the Commission's report, but headwinds against the basic enterprise that Paul puts on the table. We've developed a deep allergy in this country, and I suspect pervasively in the world, to nuance and complexity. As Bob said earlier, the essence of this report is complexity. This is hard stuff. You've gotten this afternoon a small sampling of the joy that I think it's fair to say each of us derived from this process. I think that I was able to attend every one of the Commission's meetings, every part of every one of those meetings. They tend to go for at least a day and a half, sometimes two. I don't think there was a single moment in any of those meetings that I wasn't having an intellectual feast just listening to the extraordinary people that the Prime Minister assembled. He created a magnetic force in the Commission where we each wanted to come back to hear. Just take today's conversation and multiply it, driven by this tremendous philosophers committee that would produce for each of the meetings reports. And God bless you, Jeremy, for your chairpersonship of that. And God bless each of the people that was involved in that. But most of all, I want to say to each of the commissioners involved, the tremendous gratitude that as a somewhat participant, but delighted auditor, I want to express the joy it was. I don't think, just as there wasn't today, you know, if you went down, sometimes the test is, you know, what would you throw back? There wasn't a single comment that was made by anyone today. And I should add, by the way, not a single question that was raised that one would want to do without in this intellectual feast that we had. But then just to take this and multiply it by orders of magnitude. And I know it's been said before, but I'm just going to close with this. There really is only one person I know that could have pulled all of this together, who has the scope of intellect and knowledge, the depth of commitment, and frankly, the global contacts that he has. It's about 20 years ago that the great blessing of his friendship came into my life. I'm delighted to say that he then became a great blessing for NYU. We're very proud of our association with him. We're very proud that he has a doctorate from this university, albeit an honorary one. A little known fact of him was that he was the rector of the University of Edinburgh at the age of 27. So that gives the students in the audience something to aim for. But his accomplishments are legendary, And they They range across everything. And I think that as we close, on behalf of every member of the commission, on behalf of everyone that's here today, on behalf of our university, but most of all, on my own behalf, I want to thank a person who was a hero to me and a hero to many, Gordon Brown. God bless you for getting this done. And with that, let's all go and let's use this report, study it carefully, disseminate it widely, and get out and tilt those windmills, because if we don't tilt them, they will not fall. God bless you all.